last year we talked about cosmetics and medications on Pesach. And we took a slightly different angle because cosmetics and medications are things that for the most part are inedible. And as a result, there's a good reason for us to permit them. There's a lot of confusion with the term Chometz Nuksheh, which I want to discuss tonight and explain why it's only a borrowed term when it comes to the modern day application, at least for most things. Has anyone ever heard of that term Chometz Nuksheh before? Chometz Nuksheh is a term doesn't actually appear in the Gemara or the Mishnah, but it's used by the Rishonim and the Poskim to describe a certain kind of wheat product or grain derivative that does not have a full leavening process. It's almost like a retarded leavening. And I don't mean that in the...
I know, I just realized.
I don't mean that... Right. So, yeah. Some people have used that term to describe certain ingredients that you can find in medications and cosmetics. But as we'll see, that's a misapplication, because Chometz Nuksheh has certain stringencies that really shouldn't even apply to the lotions and the medications that we wish to use and ingest on Pesach. And I'm going to get to that in just a second.
Okay, what does the word Nuksheh mean?
You'll see in just a minute. We will define it. Obviously, you see the word kasheh in there, but we will define it. I actually have on page 2 an entry from the Encyclopedia Talmudis that I'd like to go over with you, just an abridged extraction from there. Okay, so it really starts in the Mishnah, in source number 1, which is a Mishnah Maseches Pesachim Perek Gimel Mishnah Aleph. We're going to see 2 Mishnayos this evening, and then we'll see a piece of Gemara as well. The Mishnah says, Elu ovrin bepesach. The following things you are over. Now, what does that word over mean? That's in itself a machlokes. Usually, what does the word over mean? You transgress, you're in violation of, right? Well, not necessarily so. Let's see. So what are these things? If I guess you have them on Pesach. Kutach habavli, v'shecher hamodi, v'chometz ha'edomi, v'zisum hamitzri, v'zuman shel tzvayim, v'amilon shel tabachim, v'kolan shel sofrim. All of these are household items in the times of the Mishnah. The Bartanura goes through all of these items, but let's just see the underlying portions in the Bartanura in source number 2. He says, Elu ovrin does not mean that you are over anything if you have them in your possession on Pesach, but rather, Elu misboarim min ha'olam. But it means these are things that you must remove. La'avor, or laha'avir, really is the correct conjugation. You have to remove it from your possession. Now that's not the way Rashi learns, which is already you see that there's like a red light going off. Something is afoot over here. What does Rashi say in source number 3? Ve'ilu ovrin alehen bebal yirah bal yimatzeh. That if you have these things in your possession, you're actually in violation of, in transgression of, the commandment of not having in your possession chametz on Pesach. Okay. Now, what are these things? So first of all, it's important to know that the Bartanura is not making this up. He's quoting Rabbeinu Tam, which is in source number 4. We won't go through it in it. But Rabbeinu Tam's basic argument is, we never find that something that is not completely chametz, should ever fall under the rubric of Bal Yirah and Bal Yimatzeh. Only something which is actual chametz, which these things are not, you should be in violation if you possess them. And therefore, what he concludes that when the Mishnah says Elu ovrin, it cannot mean that you're in transgression of Bal Yirah or Bal Yimatzeh. It rather means you must remove them. And why must you remove them? So the Bartanura continues and he says, Da'af al gav de'ein ovrim aleim al Bal Yirah. Even though there's no transgression biblically, midarabanan mihat tzrichi biur. But nevertheless, rabbinically, you need to get rid of them. That that there's another kind of retarded chametz called seor, not seor, but seor, which we will define momentarily. That's going to be in the next Mishnah that we're going to see. That even though there's no isser in eating it, you still have to remove it. Now, the Bar Tanura tells us what these things are, and actually he tells us that in this list, there's actually different things in this list that are prohibited for different reasons. He says kutach habavli, for example, he says this Babylonian kutach, which is a sour milk drink, he says asui mipas me'ufash v'chalav. He says it's made from moldy bread and milk. Doesn't sound that appetizing, but that's what a kutach is. It was used as a salad dressing or a dip. People would dip their vegetables or their bread in this thing. And sheichar hamadai, he says, sheichar shayu osin b'madai michitim osrim shurim b'mayim v'chometz b'mayim. This is like a beer that's made from grain. He says all of these other things. Now these are things that are completely edible. There's nothing wrong with their edibility. What's the issue over here? He says, if you look at the next underlined section, Ad kan chometz haroi la'achila al yedei ta'aroves. He says, these items contain chometz, but they only contain chometz that is edible when it's mixed in with something else. In other words, this is a compound that has edible chometz in it. And the reason why it doesn't rise to the level of regular chometz, why is beer different from regular chametz? Because the chametz that is contained within it is part of a tarovis, is part of a mixture. And therefore you have this machlokes rishonim. Number one, is a tarovis chametz, are you over, if you have it in your possession, are you over in Bal Yirah, Bal Yimotze, or is there only an Isser D'Rabbanan of having it in your possession on Pesach? So that's one category, but this is not Chometz Nuksheh. And now he goes on and he says, Mikan va'elach Chometz Nuksheh be'ene. Now he says the next part of the list are things which were called Chometz Nuksheh. He hasn't defined what Chometz Nuksheh is, but just hold on. He says, what are examples of Chometz Nuksheh? Zuman shel tzvaim, he says, mayim shenostin bahem subin. It's water that you put bran in, that's used that dyers use commercially. Umishtamshim bahem hatzvaim lemalachtan. It's used for that, like is it commercially? Va'amilan shel tabachim, which is a type of pas she'osin mikemach tavua shelo hivia shlish bishula. Umechasin bo es hakedera lisho v'sazuhama. What is a milan? A butcher's amilan? He says it's a type of culinary tool that is made out of a kind of dough that is made from wheat that has not properly ripened. They would take unripened flour, unripened wheat, grind it into a flour, mix it with water, make it into a dough, and then place it as a cover on a pot of cooking stew. And the function of this dough was to draw out the bad odors that would emanate from the cooking stew. I don't know exactly how it worked, but that's the way it was done. This is a type of dough that does not become actual chametz. There's a retardation of the leavening process at some point, and it never becomes fully chametz. Another example is v'kolan shel sofrim, is afar harechayim megablim oso b'mayim. He says what you do is you take the wheat dust after you've milled wheat and milled it into flour. You go back to the grindstone and you sweep off some of the very, very fine powder of the flour. You mix it with water, and then the sofrim medavkim bo nioroseim, and bookbinders use it to glue the covers to the books. So it's used to make glue. Okay? So once again, this is not considered to be real chametz. It's a chametz that's retarded in its leavening process. And then the Mishnah continues and it says that Rabbi Eliezer Omer aftach shitei nashim. He says even women's jewelry. He says, so what is the addition that Rabbi Eliezer is adding? So the Bar Tanura tells us He says, "De'ilu tanakama lesle ela chametz dagan gamor al yedei tarovis o chametz nuksheh be'enei, v'Rabbi Eliezer mosif av tachshitei nashim shehin chametz nuksheh al yedei tarovis samemonim acherim." So he says that there's a type of women's jewelry or adornment that is made from dough mixed with other ingredients that give it color and give it texture, I suppose. And the Gemara says it's also a kind of flour that is used, when it's mixed with other things, you could use it to remove hair. It has some kind of quality to it, that when you roll it along the flesh, it has a stickiness to it, and it can remove hair. So Rabbi Eliezer is adding that not only is Chometz Nuksheh problematic when it is without any additives, but even if there are additives to it, so that it's now both a taroves, it's a mixture that's not pure chametz, and it's Chometz Nuksheh, that too you're obligated to remove from your possession on chametz, on Pesach. So you see that there's a certain kind of category of chametz product or wheat product that is not fully chametz, and therefore not all the rules of the Yisur of chametz apply to it. But nevertheless, the Mishnah tells us that you have to dispose of it and you cannot have it in your possession on Pesach. Now, we don't need to go into all of these other things. The next Mishnah in source number 5 says, Se'or yisareif v'ha'ochlo patur. Siduk yisareif v'ha'ochlo chayav karet. That se'or is a certain kind of dough that you're obligated to destroy before Pesach, but if you eat it, you're not in violation because it's a retarded form of chametz. However, siduk, which is another kind of dough, it's another level of leaven, that is something that you have to get rid of, and if you eat it, you get kares because it's much closer to actual chametz. And then the Mishnah tells us, Ezehu se'or kekarnei chagavim. What is the definition of se'or? That when the dough, when it starts to ferment, it develops cracks that are like grasshopper's antenna. So it starts to develop fissures in the dough, very, very tiny fissures, but it doesn't expand completely. So therefore it's a retardation of the leavening process. And siduk shenisarvu sedakav zebazeh divrei Rabbi Yehuda, but siduk is a much more robust kind of leaven that the dough expands further, and therefore it's mamish chametz, because the cracks have become much larger and started to connect to each other. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. V'chachamim omrim v'zeh v'zeh ha'ochlo chayiv kares. They say no. Both when there's tiny antenna-like cracks or larger cracks, that's mamish chametz. But ve'ezehu se'or kol shehichsifu panav ke'adam sha'amdu sa'arotav. He says what se'or is that in the course of leaving out this dough, there's so much retardation of the leavening process that chemically it develops a white kind of film on the surface, doesn't expand really with any cracks at all on the surface, and it looks like a person who's gone pale from fright. That's what the Mishnah says. Okay, and the Bartanura over here says, V'halacha kachacham. Okay, so once again, you've got a description of a type of chametz where there's been a retardation of its leavening. And now we're going to see this essay this entry from the Encyclopedia Talmudis, who talks about Chometz Nuksheh. It's in source number 7. And this is an abridged, just a selection of it's a much longer entry. We'll just take a look. He says, Chometz Nuksheh, Chometz shemitchilat chimutzo eino ra'oi la'achila, o she'eino Chometz gamur. He says, this is a type of chametz that from the very inception of its leavening, there has been something to render it inedible or something to retard the leavening process. So either it's not fully edible or it's not fully leavened. Either one. So as you can imagine, the glue that the bookbinders use, regardless of whether it's leavened or not, it's not edible from its inception. Now, from its inception, mitchilato is a very important point. Because as we're going to see, if you have something that's been denatured, we talked about this last year, I don't expect anyone to remember, but if you have something that's fully edible, and you put an additive into it to make it inedible, then that's going to be more problematic, potentially, than Chometz Nuksheh. Because here, it never was edible. It's not that it was edible at one point and you denatured it. Here, it was never edible or it was never Chometz. So let's take a look. He says, Mahuso vigidro. So he says, what is it and how do you quantify it? He says, Chometz Nuksheh lo huskar b'mishnah o b'vraisa ela shebetalmud v'rishonim Korobkin lekama minei chometz she'ein dinam kechometz gomer. So I just needed to correct myself. It's not in the Mishnah or the Brisa, but you do find it in the Gemara. You find it as a terminology in the Rishonim. They use the term Chometz Nuksheh as a generic terminology for a number of different things that are not completely leaven. Umuvano Chometz ra v'kasheh v'nim'as mila echol. So to answer Manny's question, he tells you this is the definition. It's either bad, hard, or difficult, or something that's unseemly for eating. O chametz ra'ua, kolomar shafal, she'eno lo chametz v'lo matzah. Or it's a very weak form of chametz, which is not fully leavened. V'danu bo bein le'inyan isser chametz b'Pesach, u'bein le'inyan menachos, she'yesh men shabos chametz v'yesh shabos matzah, im dino kechametz o kematzah, o she'eno lo chametz v'lo matzah. So this has halachic ramifications both for Hilchos Pesach, and it also has ramifications for Hilchos Menachos, because we know that certain Menachos must be made from unleavened flour, certain Menachos must come from leavened flour, and then the question that's undertaken in the Gemara in Menachos is, what is the status of Chometz Nuksheh? Is it leavened? Is it unleavened? Or is it a third category, which is neither? Okay, good, fine. So he continues and he says, Kama dvarim shehem bichlal chometz nuksheh nimnu b'mishnah. V'heim, he says, there are a number of things that are quantified as chometz nuksheh in the Mishnah. He says, Zuman shel tzvayim, that he says, Zuman shel tzvayim is meisubin shetzovin bahem. It's a certain kind of bran water that dyers use. Va'amilan shel tabachim pastavur shelo hivishli shemenichal pikeder v'shavis hazuama. This is the type of dough that you place over the pot that we discussed. V'kolan shel sofrim, v'hu devek ha'asui mikemach u'mayim shemedavkim bo haratzanim et oroteihem v'hasofrim et nioroteihem. It's a kind of glue that bookbinders use and also shoemakers use, he says. Minim elu bichlal nukshehem lefi she'enam ru'uyim la'achila. He says the reason why these in this Mishnah are considered to be nuksheh is because they're not really edible. He says that they were never edible. Why do I have to point that out? She says, he says, if something was at one point edible, and then it becomes inedible, you mamish couldn't even get a dog to eat it. But over here, in order for it to be demoted from its status of chametz, since it was never edible, it doesn't have to be all the way nifsal me'achilas kelev. A person could still munch on these things if he was really, really hungry. You know, you could still eat them. It's not something that a person would normally eat, and therefore it no longer qualifies as chametz. The yesh meforshim shenikroim nuksheh lefi she'enam chametz gamur. Some say that it's not completely leavened. The yesh min ha'achronim meforshim af ma she'amru she'enam ru'uyim la'achila. Some say that you really have to, the two ideas converge. What it means, we say that it's not really edible, it means it's not edible in its, because it hasn't leavened properly. Either way, it either means that it's not really edible, or it's not fully leavened. He says, Af batzek shelo hechmitz kol tzarcho v'hu nikra se'or, danu bo mishum chametz nuksheh she'eno chametz gamur sheyatsa michlal matzah u'lichlal chametz lo ba. So he says, this se'or, this type of dough that has begun the leavening process and it was retarded in some way, is also chametz nuksheh. It's no longer matzah, but it never entered into the realm of chametz. Or either that or because it's considered inedible. That's the way some Meforshim learn. and it doesn't have the ability to, as a leavening agent, to leaven other things. He continues. Now you have another consideration, that there is the term Chometz Nuksheh is sometimes applied even to egg matzah or fruit juice matzah, which again is considered to be an item that does not have the ability to fully leaven. So he says, Af ladas asovrim she'ena nasa chametz gomer nases chametz nuksheh. So it does become chametz nuksheh, which is why, right, Ashkenazim, this is a whole separate discussion of egg matzah on Pesach, but it's why Ashkenazim certainly don't eat this on Pesach. Machlokas rishonim im hadvarim amurim benosan lesocho mayim uvelo mayim ein machmitzim klal o sha'af below mayim nases chametz nuksheh avol nasan lesochen mayim hareza chametz gomer od ayin chametz. He says it's a machlokes of the Rishonim if the things that are mentioned in this list of Chometz Nuksheh, benosan l'socha mayim, right? If you put water into them, they will leaven further, but if you don't put in water into them, they don't become Chometz at all. Or would we say that it becomes Chometz Nuksheh by adding other items other than water? He says that's a separate discussion. I refer you to another entry in the encyclopedia. I'm skipping some portions, and he says like this: Lahalacha nechluku rishonim. There's a machlokis in the Rishonim. Yesh sovrim shahalacha kistam mishnah ucha Rabbi Meir shechametz nuksheh aser ba'achila min haTorah bilav v'loke. Some say that if you eat Chometz Nuksheh on Pesach, and we have different categories of Chometz Nuksheh, then you get Malkus. V'yesh sovrim sha'af al pi sha'aser min haTorah eino loka keven she'eno roi la'achila ve'ein zu achila gemura. Some say that no, Chometz Nuksheh, at least the first types of Chometz Nuksheh that we've discussed, are not really meant for eating, and therefore you can't get Malkus if you eat it. V'yesh sovrim she'eno aser ela midrabanan, and some say that there's only a rabbinic isser. Shahalacha Rabbi Yehuda, O Shahalacha Chachamim Hasovrim came b'taroves chametz, the kol shekain b'nuksheh. Okay, without getting you bogged down with all of the shittas, you see that there's a variety of opinions here. V'yesh min achronim shekasvu sha'af lahasovrim shechametz nuksheh ein bo lav hainu davka ba'osam sheshaninu shenimruim la'achila. Aval isa shenilosha b'mei peros ba'ofen shenases chametz nuksheh kevin sheruuya la'achila divrei hakol yesh bo lav. Some say you have to demarcate between the earlier definitions of chametz nuksheh and the latter chametz nuksheh of like fruit juice matzah. He says there you would get a lot. In other words, the point is, you see from this whole entry, chametz nuksheh is a generic term. It can be applied to a number of different items that are not fully edible, items that have not fully leavened, or a combination of the two. Yes?
What happens if you eat real chametz? You don't get it.
You get karetz.
Karetz. So what are they doing here? I'm unclear. It's not considered chametz, but it's just a funny category.
Right. It's a funny category where there's no karetz for it.
No karetz,
but you're over on a mitzvah lo saseh of not.
What would be the source of that mitzvah lo saseh? They're saying midiraisa, right?
You'd have to say that there's a right. I don't remember the whole sugya, but there must be a pasuk that prohibits eating all chametz products, and doesn't say specifically karetz. I don't remember the whole discussion. You can go further into it by looking at the encyclopedia and going through the footnotes. Im yesh iser hana min haTorah b'chametz nuksheh. Now the question is there an iser of benefit from chametz nuksheh? Lahasovrim sha'aser ba'achila min haTorah kasv rishon shetoli b'machlokas amaroyim. He says, for those who say that chametz nuksheh is aser for eating min haTorah, so then some Rishonim say that there's a machlokus now whether it's aser b'hana. Shel Rabbi Avo hasover shekol iser achila shebetor kol alaf iser hana ad sheyafarit lecha kasav heter hana av chametz nuksheh aser b'hana. He says, according to Rabbi Avo in the Gemara, since the Torah doesn't give you an absolute dispensation that even though it's aser b'achila you're allowed to benefit from it, we assume that it's aser b'hana as well. But ulechizkiya hasover shalamedim iser hana shel chametz bepesach miloshem lo ye'achel ein chametz nuksheh bichlal ha'isur. He says, however, according to another Amora named Chizkiya, who says that the term lo ye'achel does not apply to Chometz Nuksheh, but it's still an Isser Midioraisa, nevertheless, so you see, according to him, it will be permitted for Hana. V'yesh min harishonim shekasav she'af lechizkiya keven shenisra be'isser Hana b'chometz milo ye'achel kol yisuri chometz b'chlal. He says, and there are some Rishonim who say that even according to Chizkiya, there'll still be an Isser of Hana on Chometz Nuksheh. Umikol makom mid'Rabbanan asur b'Hana l'divrei hakol shekein shaninu se'or yisaref. V'af l'das asorvim shisur achilos mid'Rabbanan asuru af b'Hana. But the bottom line is that everyone agrees that there's at least a rabbinic prohibition of deriving benefit from Chometz Nuksheh on Pesach.
Is the issue of Hana equivalent to whether it qualifies as Chometz Shavar Lav Pesach?
I think that would be a separate issue. Chometz Shavar Lav Pesach may only be limited to actual Chometz. It may not apply to Chometz Nuksheh. You would have to go back and look at the takana that the Chachamim made, but you can't necessarily equate the two.
No, in fact, I think I saw that distinction, that the difference between Chometz and Chometz Nuksheh is that Chometz Nuksheh doesn't have a din of Chometz Shavar Lav Pesach.
Right. Okay. And I think he may even discuss that in a century. I don't remember anymore. Now, if we were going to just use the information that we have at hand, then we would conclude that any kind of grain product, even though it's rendered inedible, would be problematic to derive benefit from on Pesach. But there's one crucial ingredient that we haven't yet seen. That there's something that the Gemara identifies that is even less of a problem than Chometz Nuksheh, and it's going to be completely permitted. And that's where we get into our discussion of cosmetics and medication, because most, certainly medications, would fall under the rubric that we've described of being completely inedible. Not all. There may be some that a person wouldn't normally eat but could be eaten. Let's say if you have like a certain kind of, there's a certain kind of sponge that people use that's made from coarse grain, and that might, I don't know, am I describing something that sounds familiar? People use grain in certain kinds of detergents. Some people will use some kinds of medication that have a grain base that is a liquid grain base.
Wheat-based soap.
A soap that may have a wheat base and so forth, right? So all of these things may fall under the category of Chometz Nuksheh, but it would be rare to find such an example. In those situations, one would not be allowed to eat or derive benefit from those items on Pesach. But there's another category which we're going to see now in source number 8. The Gemara now says, Tanu Rabbanan, Arei vas ha'avdanim shenosam l'socha kemach. You have a trough which is used by tanners, people who manufacture hide. And it was customary to put flour in, and I think they do that even today. They use some kind of chemical that has this drying, it has the quality that it dries the hide. It dehydrates the hide. And that was the purpose of putting in flour, because the flour will remove the moisture from the hide so that it can be processed. Okay? So, toch shlosha yamim chayev levayer. If you added the flour to the tanner's trough within 3 days of Pesach, the flour has not been rendered inedible to a complete extent, and therefore you'd have to clean out the trough and remove it before Pesach. However, kodem shlosha yamim eino chayav levayer. But if you put this flour in more than 3 days in advance of Pesach, so then you can assume that any flour that was in there, because of all the other chemicals and disgusting stuff that's in there, you can assume that the flour is completely rendered inedible, and you don't have to remove it at all. Omar Rabbi Nasan banet dvarim amurim shelo nasan l'socha oros. Avol nasan l'socha oros afilu toch shlosha ein chayav levayer. He says, but that's only true if you didn't put the actual pelts into the trough. But if you put the pelts into the trough and added flour, even if the flour was added within 3 days of Pesach, you wouldn't have to remove that flour, because we can assume that the presence of the pelts mixing with the flour has rendered the flour inedible immediately, and you don't have to. It doesn't have to linger there for more than 3 days in order for it to be rendered inedible. Let's take a look at the Shulchan Aruch in source number 10, who says as follows. This is in Siman Taf Mem Beis Sif Aleph, and he writes that Tarovis Chometz over Malav Mishum Bal Yira'o Bal Yimotze, that if you have something that is a mixture, and part of that mixture contains Chometz, then there is an Isser of Bal Yira'o Bal Yimotze. He paskins, Shulchan Aruch paskins, at least on the first part of the Mishnah, like Rashi. It says Elu Ovrin, it means that you're over in Bal Yira'o Bal Yimotze. What are some examples? Kagon Hamurias, V'kutach habavli v'shechar hamadi v'chol kayotze be'elu midvarm hane'echalim. Anything that's edible, even though it's only a mixture, a compound that contains chametz and not chametz be'en, not actual chametz alone, you still are over by just having it in your possession. Avol davar sheyesh bo tarovis chametz ve'eno roi la'achila muter l'kaimo b'pesach. But something that is a mixture, that has a mixture of, and it has actual chametz in it, but in its compound form, it's no longer edible, then the halacha is that you're even allowed to keep it around on Pesach. And the example that he gives is kagon arevas ha'avdanim shenasan l'socho kemach ba'oros. The tanner's trough that where a flour was added, because the flour is mixed with other things that have rendered it inedible, you're allowed to keep that around over the course of Pesach. There's no Isser of Bal Yira'o Bal Yimotze. And the Mishnah Berurah tells us like this. The Mishnah Berurah tells us, if you go to Sivkat and Beis, where he was talking about Tarovis Chametz, he says, Aval Chometz Nuksheh Eino over alav mishum Bal Yira'o Bal Yimotze v'rak midrabanan tzarach leva'aro. He says that when it says Elu Ovrin in the Mishnah, it depends. When it's talking about things like beer and kutach, so those things, midioraisa, you have to get rid of on Pesach. Chametz Nuksheh, you have to only have a rabbinic obligation to get rid of on Pesach. And he says, V'nuksha mikra davar she'enu chametz gomer kama osen she'asofer medavkin bo niyo rosehem she'osen mikemach umayim o isa shelo nimtza ba adayin shum sedak rak shehichsifu paneha. He says these are examples. Bookbinder's glue, or the glue that they use for the paper, or that they make from flour and water, or a dough that has not begun to develop any crevices or fissures, or anything that's only slightly edible but not normally meant to be eaten. The davka shemei olam lo hayiroi lachila avolim niskalkel ba'ina nashi pasol milechel lekelev kuchid lekaman. But again, these are things that were never edible from their inception. If it was edible at one point and then was rendered inedible, it would have to be rendered so inedible that even a dog could not eat it. But if it was rendered inedible from its inception, then even if it's only slightly inedible, there's no Isser Midoraisa of Bal Yira'o. And if you didn't get rid of it, we'll discuss later. And then he says in Sifkat and Hay, he says, but by contrast, something that's like the flour that you put into the tanner's trough, he says, ve'eno roi la'achila, that you can keep completely. He says, v'lo gazrinan dilma asi lamechal. He says, what's the reason by Chometz Nuksheh that we don't allow you to keep it, even in midrabanan? The reason is because maybe you'll come to eat it. But this kind of product is so gross, so disgusting, that we're not worried that you're going to eat it. Keven she'ano roi la'achila klal. So he says this is not even called Chometz Nuksheh. This is not retarded Chometz. This is Chometz that was rendered completely inedible. The flour may have at one point been edible, but it's now completely inedible. It's nifsal me'achilas kelev. You're not going to want to eat it. Hareza muter l'kaimo she'oros gormim shemasriach miyad, because the hide causes it to become completely putrid. Now, what we have from all of this is a long discussion among the poskim as to just clarify and distill some of these ideas. That comes along the Chazon Ish and Siman Kuf Tes Zayin
Mishnah Berurah makes no distinction then between Chometz that was once edible and is no longer versus Chometz Nuksheh, which was never edible?
Yeah, he does make a distinction. He says that if it was never edible, then you're not over and bal yira'eh as long as it's even mildly inedible. He says if something was once Chometz and then it was rendered inedible, it has to be nifsal me'achilas kelev. It has to be completely inedible, that even a dog wouldn't go near it, in order for you not to be over and bal yira'eh. Right? Okay. Now, the Chazon Ish says in Hilchos Pesach Siman Kuf Tezayin, this is in source number 12, he says, Dinim ha'olim. He says some of the things that we can adduce from our long discussion, which I'm not presenting for you tonight. He says, Irev kemach bidvarim hapogmim es hatam. If you mix flour with ingredients that will render it inedible, av sheyesh bahem mayim mikri chametz nuksheh. He says if it has water in that compound, then it renders it as chametz nuksheh. And by rendering it as chametz nuksheh, he says then you have all of these issues with chametz nuksheh. So he says the yesh bazeh plugta im achilasa asura min haTorah u'midrabanan. And as we've seen, the Chazon Ish concurs that there's a machlokus, whether there's only an isser derabanan or there's an isser deoraisa of eating it and having it in your possession. The gam yesh ben plugta imus harnalei mishum bal yira'eh min haTorah. He says, and there's also a whole shaila whether there's a prohibition min haTorah of having it in your possession. Lamando amar da achilas asura min haTorah. If you hold that it's usher to eat it, is there also an isser of having it in your possession? Ulekule alma, asr lahashos and midarabanan below bittul. But everyone agrees that at least rabbinically you're not allowed to have these things in your possession, even though you've added things to it that render it inedible. Laman da omar da achilas and asura min haTorah, that if you hold that you're not allowed to eat it min haTorah, vafilu leachar bittul hichri ator da asr lahashos and elim kein machon lenachri va'asr lehen mechitza, that you have to actually completely remove it, or at least create a barrier after selling it to a non-Jew. He says perhaps you could be more lenient if you hold that it's only rabbinically prohibited, and therefore you would not need to sell it. Then he says, but what I've discussed now is that it's been rendered inedible, only mildly inedible. In other words, if a person were to force himself to eat it, like you have some kind of medicinal herb or something like that has been added to it, and it's meant as a salve, but you could actually go ahead and drink it if you really needed to. He says that's when there becomes a problem. He says, and this would be true, let's say, for example, this type of bookbinder's glue. He says, even if you've already designated it as glue, like we have kids' Play-Doh, I think is a very good example as well. It's made from flour. You add other ingredients to make it inedible, but it says right there on the container, non-toxic. Why? Because we know that kids are going to eat it, right? So therefore, you could eat it, but it would fall under this category of chametz nuksheh. So you're not allowed to have that in your possession on Pesach. But that's only true if it's slightly edible. Avalim nifsal me'achilas adam ve'eno ra'uya lechameya bo eno chayev levaer ve'en sarich bittul. He says, but if it's completely rendered inedible, and you notice how he says achilas adam. There's a machlokis of whether you need nifsal me'achilas adam or nifsal me'achilas kelev. There's two gradations, right? It's either inedible to humans or inedible to dogs. There's some things that dogs would eat that humans would not eat. So the Chazon Ish only requires it to be inedible to humans. He says completely a human being would never go near this. He says then you don't have to even get rid of it at all. B'zehu din arevas ha'avdanim shenosam l'sochan kemach ve'over leim gimel yamim o shenosam l'sochan oros. He says, and that's the din of the tanner's trough where you add flour to it. V'cheinim nisarvu b'tvarim marim o hamegu'alim v'nismazgu ba'ofen sheyefshel lahafridan. He says, and furthermore, let's say you mixed in other things that are bitter or so disgusting that, and you combine them in such a way that you cannot later separate the ingredients. And therefore, these things do not have to be eliminated. And not only that, but you're allowed to benefit from them on Pesach. And therefore, you can use ink on Pesach that is mixed with Chometz. And that was one of the types of methods of ink making in the old world. And the reason is because it was rendered inedible from human consumption completely before Pesach. Kofes soor or kofas soor sheyichada liyeshiva v'tach paneh habatit. Another thing that they would do is they would take spoiled bread that had become hard, and they would then coat it with plaster and make furniture out of it. It's a cheap way of, listen, you got to economize when you have very little. So they would make stools or benches out of spoiled sourdough that became, and it couldn't use it anymore. They would plaster over it, and it would become. He says that's fine. That you can use and have it in your possession on Pesach. He says, he says, even though it's theoretically possible to peel off the plaster and in some way renature it and make the yeast edible or this spoiled dough edible, he says that's okay. He says, let's say you have papers that have been glued together with a flour mixture, like a glue made from flour. He says, even though theoretically you could steam the papers apart and harvest the flour, but since it's been rendered inedible at one point, he says it's okay. And also, if you have clothing that's been laundered with, what is chelev chita? What do you think that is? Starch. Exactly. Clothing that's been laundered in starch, leavened, wheat starch. We use potato starch, right? But let's say you take your clothing to the dry cleaner or to the Chinese laundry, starch or no starch, right? And they give you they put starch in your shirts, and you find out, oh my goodness, I'm coming to the Seder with a nicely pressed shirt that was used. They used.
Right? Get hot under the collar.
Right. So they used starch. The Chazon Ish holds that that's not a problem because it's not even Chometz Nuksheh. He says that goes beyond. That's like the kemach that's been added to the tanner's trough. Okay? And notice how the Chazon Ish is of the opinion that even if there were a way, in theory, to extract the flour and in some way figure out how to add it to a cooking food, it's still okay. Because apparently he holds that once you've processed it up to a certain point, even if you could renature it in some way, it's been so denatured, it's not a problem. And one more paragraph in the Chazon Ish. Yeah.
So does that go, you hear about have to have kosher Pesach, napkins, paper towels, because there might be starch in it. That would sound like it's not an issue.
Well, here's the issue. Some poskim say that the fact that there may be starch in a paper plate, there you're actually ingesting it. So the Chazon Ish is only allowing you to have these things in your possession and to get benefit from them, but not to actually ingest them. He's not advocating that you can go and ingest these things.
Napkins and paper towels.
Well, the issue, I don't think, right, that's the thing, is that you take a paper plate. I've never heard of the issue with napkins. I've never heard that napkins you have to be worried about. But I've heard of paper plates that some poskim say they may have some wheat starch in them. So that's where, or maybe even cornstarch, because it's kidneys. And there, when you put on something with a gravy, it'll seep through and it'll absorb the starch, and that's why there may potentially be a problem. I think that it's extremely, again, I'm not an expert in the manufacturing process, but I find it unlikely today, except maybe the very, very cheap paper plates, that you have to worry about this. But I always tell my wife better to buy foam plates instead of paper plates on Pesach to avoid that problem. Anyway, or plastic plates. And then finally, in the third paragraph, he says, Tablaos refuah, shemura ben kemach. You've got tablets, medical tablets that you take for medicinal tablets that are, so he says that if they have flour as the base, so here comes, he says, Im ein mu'urav behen mayim. He says, if there's no water, he says, up until now we've been talking about things that there may be water mixed in, and that makes them Chometz Nuksheh. He says, but if there's no water in them at all, rak mei peiros ein bohem mishum Chometz. He says, if only other liquids were added to the tablet other than water, then you don't have to worry that it even became to a point of being Chometz. V'im mu'urav bohem mayim yesh bohem mishum Chometz Nuksheh. If, however, water was added, and it may have come to a point of inedibility or retardation, then there's a problem of Chometz Nuksheh if there's a wheat base in the tablet. But if in the manufacturing of the pill it was completely dry before it had a chance to become Chometz, so then there wouldn't be a problem at all. So Rav Moshe and Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank both deal with the tshuva about denatured alcohol. You have denatured alcohol, which is a base in many household items, let's say mouthwash or perfumes, that are used as not food items, but are used for medicinal purposes or are used as cosmetics. Are you allowed to use that? And the question is, there are a number of shilas that are undertaken, and we'll just go through this very quickly. He says, "B'davar lasuch al chatatin begufo kishein bo sakana raktsar ba'alma meshicha shenasan lo harofe shemurav sham alcohol shel chametz bepesach shekvod toraso hora leheter." He says, you asked me the following question: are you allowed to use an ointment or some kind of salve that alleviates discomfort? So there's clearly no sakana here. It's just you want to use it as a salve. The doctor gives it to you. It has denatured alcohol, but it's made out of chametz. Are you allowed to use that on Pesach? So you paskin, says Rav Moshe to the questioner, you paskin that it's okay. So he says, Yafa hora, you good gesagt, you said the correct thing. The mitzad isur sicha bi isurin harei l'Rabbeinu tam benida daf lamed beis lo shayach klal sicha kishasiya. He says, because there is a discussion in the Balei HaTosfos whether we hold of sicha kishasiya. Is anointing like drinking? There is such a shita that, on the Rishonim, that says that anything that you anoint on your body for comfort is a form of drinking. It's a form of ingestion. So therefore, you could argue that it's problematic. You're not just benefiting from this item that contains chametz, and even if you want to say that it's chametz nuksheh, and it's rendered inedible, and therefore you're allowed to have it in your possession, but you're doing more than having it in your possession. It's a form of ingestion because sicha kishasiya. So Rav Moshe rejects that out of hand. Rav Moshe says we never paskin sicha kishasiya except by hilchos truma and with olive oil, and that's clear from Tosfos. Even though he says that Tosfos contradicts himself in a couple of places, but he says al kolpanim ledina savri haTosfos deleka iser sicha kishasiya bechele v'sha'ar u'sha'ar isurim. Tosfos clearly says that it only applies to oil, and it only applies to truma. It doesn't apply to other prohibited substances. So therefore, he says, and furthermore, that's only when it's a sicha shel ta'anug. He says, but if it's not a sicha shel ta'anug, if it's to alleviate discomfort or for medicinal purposes, then it would certainly be okay.
Tosfos says that it has to be both of those qualities, oil and truma.
It seems that way from Tosfos. Tosfos is ambiguous, and because that's where you have to go through Rav Moshe's tshuva. He says that in one place in Yuma he says one thing, and in Avodah Zarah he says another thing. Is it Avodah Zarah? Nida, he says one thing, in Yuma he says another thing. So it's really not clear. But the bottom line is, he says, it wouldn't apply in our situation. And therefore you don't have to worry about it. He says, Aval Pasha, going to the last paragraph, Shehu Rak Yeshanasa HaMashicha Kodem HaPesach. To be Pesach Kufe Kevin Shekvar Nesar Bahana Kishalo Nisarek Bahamashicha Asr Af Acher She'ervu Bahamashicha V'Nifsal Me'achila. He says, but you would have to make it inedible before Pesach. You would not be allowed to take an edible alcohol that's chametz and mix it on Pesach to render it inedible. He says that we would never allow you to do. Just like if bread becomes moldy on Pesach and becomes inedible, it's not going to obviate the problem of it having been chametz on Pesach. He says, "Va'alkohol atzmo kishu be'en lo nechshav nisel me'achila sheyesh minachrim sheshosin osal yedei taroves v'tikun k'tzas." He says, even denatured alcohol, there's a way to renature it and to render it drinkable. He says, winos do it all the time. Guys on Skid Row will figure out a way to take even denatured alcohol and reconstitute it in some way. Aval ayin barambam perik hey me yesodei hatorah lachaches de shelo keder chanasim de muter lasus melugna michametz kan bepesach af lechola she'en bo sakana mishum shu shelo keder chanasam vehevi mikakesef mishnah mi'archos chaim dehu michametz shel nachri v'hanachri asa hamelugma. So he says, but if a Gentile makes the compound on Pesach, it seems from the Rambam that would be okay as long as it was the Gentile's chametz. V'lachein yachol kisheyesh lo tsar tu b'lasus b'pesach hamashicha b'drugstore shel nachri. And therefore Rav Moshe paskins that you could even go to the apothecary on Chol HaMoed and have him take perfectly good drinkable alcohol, combine it with an herbal or medicinal ingredient that renders it completely inedible, and you could use that as your salve on Pesach.
It would have to be a non-Jew pharmacist.
It would have to be a non-Jewish pharmacist, because therefore he wouldn't be over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzah. So Rav Moshe is completely lenient when you have something that's made of alcohol, but it's rendered inedible, it's undrinkable anymore, then there's no problem in using it. So there are a number of issues that modern kashrus agencies suggest being machmir in. Number one, they say that on Pesach there are some shitas who do hold sicha kishasiya, that anointing yourself is like drinking. Even though from the Bali Atosvos and from Reb Moshe he says it's not an issue to be reckoned with, they still say that there's yesh lahachmir, or some people are machmir, and also there's a concern that you could in some way distill even an item that's made from denatured alcohol, and in some way you could extract the alcohol and reconstitute it and make it drinkable, and therefore anything that's made from alcohol you should avoid using on Pesach, even if it's in its current state it is completely inedible. So that's why there are some poskim who are machmir. I just want to point out, it's a chumrah. It's a chumrah. So me'ikar hadin, anything that doesn't have alcohol in it at all, even if it's made, even if it has flour in it, right? But it's been made into such a compound in solid form that it's completely inedible. So if you have any kind of lotion or powder or cosmetic, perfectly fine. You don't have to go to a Pesach list to find kosher Pesach cosmetics. Anytime you need to take medicine for any kind of illness, you can assume that any prescription medication, essentially, you can assume is perfectly fine. You don't have to go to a special Pesach list. The only issues that you have are if you have liquids or near liquids that have an alcohol base. There, especially if it's something that you're going to be putting inside your body, ingesting, there's a reason to be machmir, like mouthwash. There you should actually verify that the mouthwash is kosher LePesach. Most mouthwash is, but not all, so therefore it's worthwhile to I think the COR says this year that Listerine, classic Listerine, is kosher l'Pesach. Right? They checked it out.
There are non-alcohol mouthwashes.
And there are non-alcohol mouthwashes that would seem to be fine. Some poskim are machmir by flavored lipsticks, or all lipsticks for that matter. Because even though it's a solid, but if you're going to be putting it in your mouth and you may be tasting some of it, so then you should be machmir with lipstick as well. Not you, I mean your wives. So chapstick might be an issue as well. Chapstick might be an issue as well. But really, for years I was relying on a lot of these Pesach lists, and then I saw that the OU says all of these Pesach lists are superfluous and unnecessary. Right? If you go through what it says in the OU booklet, they say you don't need lists, and it's based on Rav Moshe, it's based on Rav Tzu Pesach Frank, it's based on the Chazon Ish, it's based on a number of poskim who feel that this is an excessive chumrah. If a person wants to be machmir and use the Pesach booklets and the lists for medications and cosmetics and so forth, tavo alav bracha, a blessing should befall him as long as he doesn't end up disrupting shalom bayis in the process. But you have to remember there are economic considerations. There are shalom bayis considerations when it comes to a woman's favorite product that she wants to use. And you can't drive her crazy about, telling her it's got to be on the list. And if it's on the list, you can't use it. Okay, lipstick is really the only issue that you should be machmir about. Mouthwash, toothpaste, almost all toothpaste is considered okay. But that could be an issue if in theory, that could be something that we would call Chometz Nuksheh because it's not completely inedible. And therefore, those are things that you should take into consideration.
Vitamins which are not a prescription.
Non-prescription food supplements, like vitamins, so there I also advocate that you should make sure that they're kosher l'Pesach. I recently had a question about someone who is lactose intolerant. And we generally tell people who are lactose intolerant that you should buy the lactate milk, buy it before Pesach, because even though there's kitnius in there, but if it's batel before Pesach, so then it's not a problem to drink it on Pesach. But she said, well, what about, there's a lactate pill to consume non-milk dairy products like cheese and things like that. So what about that? So because it's something that you're ingesting, so my response was like this: if the person in question can derive adequate nutrition without eating cheese on Pesach, then that would be preferred. If the only way that they can eat cheese is by taking the pill on Pesach, because you shouldn't ingest kitnius for gratuitous reasons, right? If it's something that you need because, the mother here was telling me that my daughter is a very finicky eater, and she may not get enough nutrition if I don't let her take these pills because she just won't eat anything. So then that's a consideration. Then I would say, okay, so then let her take the pills on Pesach. But if a person just wants to have, his kosher l'Pesach pizza, right, and but he needs to take this lactate pill, and I would say, no, you know what, you'll wait until after Pesach, have a real pizza. Okay, it's very confusing. I admit it's not straightforward. There's a lot of twists and turns in these details, and that's why it's good to ask. But in general, I read for you last year from the CRC. They say like this. They say all varieties of blush, body soap, conditioners, creams, eyeshadow, eyeliner, face powder, foot powder, foundations, ink, lotions, mascara, nail polish, ointments, paint, shampoo, and stick deodorant are permitted for use on Pesach, regardless of the ingredients contained within them. Again, because of this psak that we've seen numerous times, that it's like the kemach that's placed in the tanner's trough. But if you have liquid deodorants, hair mousse, hairsprays, perfumes, colognes, and shaving lotions that contain denatured alcohol, better that you should stay away from those things unless you know that it's kosher l'Pesach, because of the concern that you could renature the alcohol in some way. But again,
the absorption through the skin, is that what they're concerned about on the deodorant?
Yeah, well, he says because, again, you've got, there may be an issue of it being actual chametz or reconstitutable chametz. It may be like a Chometz Nuksheh because you could always extract the alcohol from it.
Is he talking about the ownership of it or the use of it?
He's talking about the use of it. talking about the use of it. But he says, but if you shouldn't use them, but also you should put them away. You should sell them as well.
It's the problem with antifreeze and windshield wiper.
That's an interesting point.
It's poison.
I never. It is poison, but I guess.
And they die from it, so.
Well, if it's something that's poison, then you wouldn't have to worry about it.